Hi class, in this video I'll be going over the approaches to research. There are many different approaches when conducting research, and they both have strengths and weaknesses. In this video I'm going to be going over case studies, naturalistic observations, survey research, archival research, longitudinal research, cross-sectional research, and in a future video I'll be going over correlational and experimental research. So a case study is a detailed examination of one particular person or small group of people. Case studies often include the study of people with a rare condition, behavior, or illness, and the researcher details a description of the person or group's behaviors from their point of view. The researcher then condenses the information, and then the researcher provides an interpretation of what it means. This type of research involves qualitative research, which is informative data such as opinions, anecdotes, or reasons, but they don't include numerical data. Case studies are often done through interviews, observations, open-ended questions that allow a person to describe their case from their point of view, diaries, or personal notes. The strengths to case studies include that they have detailed information about a group or a person who has a rare condition, behavior, or illness. They provide context and insight for future studies. A case study may be able to provide information toward an experimental study. And then they allow researchers to investigate unethical situations. We'll learn more about ethics in a later video. And some weaknesses of case studies include that they lack generalizability, which refers to the ability to apply a research finding to the entire population. When we do research, we want our results to generalize to the entire population. There could be researcher bias if a researcher misinterprets information that they receive in order to support their own opinion. And these studies can be hard to replicate because there is only one person or one group of people who have this rare condition or illness. Some examples include the work of Freud, who investigated his patients by asking them open-ended questions in order to try and interpret what their conditions were. Most of his interpretations involved the person's subconscious and conscious issues with their mothers and fathers and how they were like when they were infants. And a criticism of Freud is that he had a lot of researcher bias in which he interpreted his patients according to his own ideals. And another example includes Jeannie, which we'll learn later in the semester. But unfortunately, she was raised by being locked in a small room with abusive and neglectful parents. She had very little social contact, which led to her inability to speak and form language later in her life. Case researchers were interested in Jeannie not only to help, but to understand how language is learned. And as you could see, Jeannie was one individual case in which researchers were interested not only why her parents did this, but what happens when we don't acquire language early in life. Moving on to a naturalistic observation. This includes observing behavior of organisms in its natural setting. This type of research involves the researcher being unobtrusive and unseen in order to not influence any natural behavior. To perform this research, researchers often use tally marks for how many times the behavior occurs or keeping a time log. They take notes on behavior. There might be audio or video placed in the environment. Psychologists usually naturally observe humans or animals. For example, a child psychologist who is interested in children's social interactions may use a one-way mirror, as you see here, in order to observe the kid's behavior so they don't influence the child's behavior. Also, Jane Goodall, who you see here, is a popular primatologist who naturally observed the behavior of chimpanzees in the wild. Some strengths to natural observation is that it is extremely accurate when investigating behavior because the behavior occurs naturally. And since there is a lot of accuracy and realism, natural behaviors can be generalized to the entire population. And some weaknesses include that they can be very difficult to construct, especially when the experimenter does not want to influence the behavior that is being observed. For example, there could be demand characteristics, which refers to subtle cues that a researcher might give to a participant and let the participant know what the experiment is about and what the researcher wants or hopes them to do. For example, if we were testing Harry or Draco and determining which is more powerful, and if we were to watch them during a duel, they might change their natural fighting behaviors if they feel that they're being watched by us. So instead, it might be better to observe their fighting from far away and not infringe on their actions. Another weakness is observer bias. This occurs when researchers unconsciously affect their interpretations of observations in favor of what they hope to see. To fix this, researchers often have strict definitions for certain behaviors and a pre-plan of what a behavior means before they observe. And lastly, there could be inter-rater reliability, which means that there should be multiple observers coding behavior in order to have consistency among the observations. The more people who are involved and who are observing the behavior limits the chance that there might be observer bias. For example, if I'm observing Harry and Draco fighting or observing chimpanzees, I would want other trained observers with me collecting the same data. We would then compare everyone's naturalistic observation and see if the inter-rater reliability was good or poor. If it was good, then our data would match up, but if it was bad, we would have different interpretations. Next is survey research. A survey is a method for researchers to collect data through self-reporting answers to various questions. Surveys can be in the form of pen and paper, electronic or verbal questionnaires. Surveys are usually completed within a short amount of time. And surveys allow researchers to obtain data from samples of a larger population. A sample is a subset of individuals selected from the entire population, and then the population is the overall group of individuals that a researcher is interested in. For example, in my Harry Potter study, my sample would be Harry and Draco, who are the wizards. I am selecting out of the larger population of wizards at Hogwarts. Some strengths of using surveys allow researchers to collect information on larger samples. Larger samples allow researchers to have better generalizability because more people who report on a survey will be more similar to the general population. Researchers are able to obtain direct information that individuals are self-reporting instead of researchers having to interpret an individual's behavior or mind. And then surveys are fairly easy to build and distribute to people in order to collect information fast and effective. But the weaknesses of surveys include that they don't really obtain a depth of information as opposed to information gained from a case study. People may provide inaccurate responses to a survey, which a researcher will use later, but that information could be false. People may lie, misinterpret the questions, or not accurately remember when responding. Also, like I said, participants can have demand characteristics in which they respond favorably to how they think the researcher wants them to respond. And then surveys could just have poorly structured questions that don't really tap into what the researcher really wants to study. People may not understand the question if it is worded in a indirect way. And then moving on to archival research. It is a method of collecting data and doing research that involves past records or data sets. Archival records include researchers' data sets, medical records, academic records, or any other information that could be accessed from a record. Researchers use archival records to investigate naturally existing public records to test a hypothesis, such as you see here or here. So they could be physical files or electronic files. Some strengths include that archival research has less time and money that researchers need to investigate a hypothesis. It's easy to access this information. And they're able to provide additional evidence when conducting research. And the researcher using archival research never really interacts with research participants, so it doesn't require as much time and money to collect the data. And this eliminates demand characteristics because there are no participants. And some weaknesses include that the researchers have no control over what information was originally collected. So the research questions can be tailored so that they could be answered within the structure of just what the dataset says. And then archival data may only offer part of what a researcher wants to study as opposed to a researcher collecting their own data. This data could be inconsistent and they may usually not be done by scientists, in which it may be difficult to interpret the data. And then moving on to longitudinal research. This type of research is a method of collecting data throughout a time period. Researchers may want to use a longitudinal approach in order to investigate changes within a person or group of people over time. For example, if we wanted to test how Harry Potter or his classmates' house as a whole did in their classes over the years, then a longitudinal study would work best to track their performance over time. For example, we would check Harry either in the first month or first year of school, and then depending on whether we want to measure his performance at school in months or years, we would have another time point to measure his performance. Some strengths to longitudinal research includes the ability to look at changes over time. Most researchers often use this method to look at developmental changes among infants and children into their teen years or adult years. Scientists are able to look at certain points in people's lives to investigate how the change develops. One interesting area of developmental psychology are twin studies and how twins who are separated at birth develop across their lifespan. Do these twins have the same characteristics even though they were raised apart from each other? Longitudinal research can answer this question. If two twins are separated at birth, we could have specific time points to measure the twins and see, even though they're alike, do they grow up and become different people if they're raised in different environments? Some weaknesses to longitudinal studies include they take a lot of time and a lot of money. It spans over a large amount of time, as you see here, and that could cost a lot of money. These types of studies can be very long, and because they're long, they could add up in price. And because they're long, participants may drop out of these studies. This is called attrition, meaning a reduction in the number of research participants due to them dropping out. They may drop out because they don't have time to participate anymore. They may forget about it, or they may not show up, or they may move away from the area. There's lots of reasons why they might drop out, but there's usually a high likelihood that participants will drop out of these studies, which makes it difficult for the researcher if they want accurate and lasting data. And then finally, we'll learn this soon, but these studies are correlational, meaning that there could only be a relationship between a group of people and a significant marker in time where they changed. But the researchers can't conclude that a certain change has a cause. Then moving on to cross-sectional research. Just as we saw, a longitudinal study involves one person or group over time, but cross-sectional research is a method that involves comparing multiple sections of a population at specific and similar time points. So going back to our example of Harry, if we only tested Harry or his classmates in his House of Gryffindor, then that would be considered a longitudinal study, as you see here. We're looking at one person or one group over 3 years. But if we compare the different houses, as you see here, if we compared Gryffindor house to Slytherin, Ravenclaw, and Hufflepuff throughout the same 3 years, so group 1 would be Gryffindor, group 2 would be Slytherin, group 3 would be Ravenclaw, and group 4 would be Hufflepuff. We would measure these groups each year and look at their performance, and then compare their performance between the groups. And this would be a cross-sectional study as opposed to a longitudinal study. The strengths of cross-sectional research include that they help assess diseases and interventions. Researchers can take data from samples of a population at different time points in order to investigate how the rates of a disease spread over time, or how a group of people going through an intervention either get better or worse over time. Cross-sectional studies can be cheaper because researchers are investigating specific time points and don't require people to continuously participate in a study over time. Cross-sectional studies are also correlational, meaning that researchers are able to show that there is a pattern or relationship between two things, but are unable to determine a cause for something. And then there could be external influence that affect the group at a certain time point. For example, if one group lives in the US and the other group lives in Canada, there can be different factors that may influence a participant's results. For example, let's say a researcher is investigating happiness between people in the US and people in Canada, and the group in Canada had a huge winter storm that affected their happiness at one point, whereas in the US, the weather was always sunny and warm. So those external influences may have had an effect on the participants' reports of happiness over time. And lastly, participants can have bias, such as demand characteristics, like we previously discussed, which can lead to inaccurate reporting. And that's it for these approaches to research. In the next video, I'll be going over correlational research and experimental research.